I'm going to talk about the Great War. That's what people called it at the time. It wasn't called World War I because they didn't know there would be a World War II and they didn't want there to be a World War II. But it was called the Great War because it was warfare on a scale that people had not seen before, but not just for that reason. Because this war, this set of experiences transformed the way people thought about themselves. The Civil War did that too. You could argue that the Civil War was the North American Great War. World War I, the war we're going to talk about today, was the European North American, perhaps global Great War. Global civil war among European powers primarily, but a war that deeply affected the United States. And I want to go right immediately in my, let's see if I can do this here, my slides, to T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, I'm sure all of you have heard of. This is a wonderful photo of him as actually a college student right before World War I. And T.S. Eliot, who becomes one of the great poets of the early 20th century, is one of many people who testify to how deeply this period affected American society. And I love to use poetry. We use it in the podcast. I love to use poetry in teaching because, first of all, I want students to be introduced to poetry. But I think poetry in few words can capture an attitude, a moment, a period. And T.S. Eliot does that with The Hollow Men, which is, I think, one of the most important poems in American history. It's the poem, the document that we're going to be talking about. I think it's neat to get students to recognize that works of literature can be primary documents. And T.S. Eliot was one of many men and women who lived through this period and felt that coming out of World War I, coming out of the early 20th century, something deep had been lost. Something in the American soul had been lost that had to be recovered. I think this poem is so powerful for students to read today. To read that we've been through these kinds of issues before. Different motivations, different framework, but a similar sense that we had lost our way. T.S. Eliot left the United States and actually spent most of his career living in England because he felt the United States had so lost its way. What was he talking about? Why did he believe this had happened? How could it be that the United States, which was this massively growing society in the late 19th century, bringing new wealth together, new technology, how is it possible that we could go through the early 20th century and find ourselves in such despair in the 19-teens and 1920s? Alongside the flappers, there's the sense of despair in our society. How did that happen? I want to talk a bit about that today. A lot of it does have to do with the United States getting involved in World War I. This is a famous image of Woodrow Wilson on April 6th, 1917, going to Congress to ask for a declaration of war. It's really important to point out to students that decisions about war and peace, like most things in our society, are partisan and are deeply divisive. We don't live in divisive times for the first time. These divisions today might be felt in acute ways that many of us don't remember in our lifetimes. But World War I was a deeply divisive issue. Many members of Congress voted against it, most famously Robert La Follette, who was a Republican from Wisconsin, presidential candidate himself. There were isolationists who were against World War I. There were internationalists who were against World War I. And it was not easy to convince people to all go along. Partisanship is deeply embedded in our society. What the parties mean, what they stand for, how they act differs over time, but partisanship is built deeply into our society. As I talk about the war, I want to talk about the failure of American neutrality, the efforts the United States undertook, which were traditional efforts to stay out of this war that really began in Europe. I want to talk about German submarine warfare, and then how the United States declared war and what effect that had. And while talking about these political and military affairs that are so significant, I want us to also keep our eye on the cultural issues that were so significant as well. And I want to show you now one of my favorite photos to teach from. It's this photo. And there's not a single American in this photo, but it might be one of the most important photos for every American student to see right now. This is the Western Front. It's northern France, Belgium, in 1916 or so. It shows what a mess World War I was. My students think that if you're just the smartest person and you figure things out, you can make the trains run. The hardest thing in life, Karl von Clausewitz, a great military theorist, says, is to actually make the trains run, to get things to work. Just look at this image. You've got vehicles going in two directions on a clogged, wet, muddy road. You've got horses and you've got mechanized vehicles going together, sort of like some people still using blackboards and others, I mean, real blackboards, and others using computers, some people typing, some people writing. And then you've got people who don't know what to do, and you've got some right in the front just posing for the camera. That would never happen in higher education, right? People just posing for the camera while the real work is done behind them. One of the biggest challenges in World War I was making the new technology of modern society work in contexts that were not well prepared for it. And the challenges that Americans confronted in looking out at this war were to think about how was it, how could we use the new technologies, the airplane just becoming a part of warfare at this time. How could these technologies be used to make our lives better, not worse? World War I in some ways was the dystopic vision of what would happen if technology was used in the pursuit of power without better political and social guidance. It also, the war was an example of what total war had become, Total war, in a certain sense, was invented in the United States during the Civil War. Ulysses Grant, Abraham Lincoln, their strategy was to pummel the South to death. That is how the Union won the war. It was a total war insofar as all the economic tools the Union had were put to work to defeat the Confederacy. The European powers learned from the American Civil War. They studied the American Civil War. The German, the French, the Russian leadership, the British leadership believed that their societies could use modern technology to have lightning warfare to win quickly. Instead, they were bogged down, as happened during the American Civil War. They were bogged down for 4 years, as in the American Civil War, in battles where the lines barely moved, but thousands of people died every day. Thousands of people died every day. This is the trench warfare that we're all familiar with, that I think we all teach in one way or another. It's really important. I don't have the time right here. It's really important to get students to understand how horrible trench warfare was, what it looked like at the time. And this had deep effects upon society. War was no longer something distant, even for Americans, because so many people were dying, so many supplies were going here. The United States sought to stay out of this war. But as I'll explain in a few minutes, it became very difficult to stay out of the war. One of the lessons for Americans was that globalization, a more global society, would be a society where the United States would have less control over its own destiny. We probably overstated our control over our own destiny. But boy, oh boy, this is a point to bring up with students today. World War I created the pandemic of 1919. The pandemic began with soldiers burying bodies in Kansas. And the influenza of that time developing in that context, spreading through boats that carried soldiers to Europe and carried them back. And then citizens coming back from war or living in the United States who were not properly nourished, did not have sufficient health care, did not understand the contagion. And that virus killed more than 625,000 people worldwide. And 625,000 people died as a consequence of that virus. It was a consequence of World War I. It's part of what T.S. Eliot is talking about. When we think about our current pandemic, we need to think about international activities, the ways international activities bring together people for profit, but the ways they also spread disease, among other things. That is not an argument against globalization. It's an argument to understand the challenges of managing globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living with that history today. And the legacies. The lost generation, those, especially in Europe, who lose their lives or lose their limbs in this war, come home and they are never the same. On a smaller scale, this happens in the United States. But for the United States, it's actually the experience of watching the most advanced societies go through this. The great British poet, Siegfried Sassoon, is one of those who writes about shell shock. The experience of now seeing the world in a new way, seeing a world filled with horror, uncertainty, danger everywhere one looks. Siegfried Sassoon wrote that fear seemed to stalk us for years after the war. For years after the war. For many Americans who didn't go through quite the same. The recognition, though, of that that's what the world was becoming, was a fearful future for them. That's part of what T.S. Eliot is talking about as well. It was also a motivation for some, for the United States to do something different. The liberal internationalism of the early 20th century, what we often call Wilsonianism, and it's not really the quite right label for it, because Wilsonian was not as internationalist as we sometimes think he was. Whatever we want to call it, that sense that the United States needed to be involved, that we needed a League of Nations, that some argued, that we needed a Kellogg-Briand Pact to cooperate, was also an outgrowth of that fear. Something had to be done. Something had to be done, so never again. So this would never happen again. Of course, those efforts were not successful. And part of the disillusion of this period was the disillusionment that came from the difficulties of getting people, getting countries, societies, and groups to work together. That should sound familiar to all of you, because it is the challenge we face today. Okay, let's talk about this in a little more depth. Here is a map of World War I, of the main areas of conflict. I don't put this up for people to study the battles in depth. The battles are very important, and they're worth talking about with students, but it depends how much time you have, and that's not my point right now. My point is for us to just discuss for a second what led to this war. It's very important to understand this was a war that was not caused by Nazis. There were no Nazis at this point. I can't tell you the number of undergraduates who tell me, yes, the Nazis caused World War I. No Nazis. World War I was caused by a structural problem in Europe, a structural problem around Germany, though it was not entirely Germany's fault. If you look at this map, you can see how large Germany was at the time, almost twice as large as it is today. Germany was too big to be just another country in Europe, but it was too small to dominate Europe. Let me say that again. Too big to be just another country in Europe, too small to dominate Europe. We are fortunate in the United States that we have long been big enough to dominate our hemisphere, and we have been able to do it. Germany had aspirations. The Germans believed by the late 19th century that they had a right to the fruits of empire that other empires around them, the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottomans, especially the British and the French, that they benefited from. They were latecomers. They did not have that benefit. Their view was that they had to expand to get access to resources, to compete with other states. Their efforts to expand created a set of alliance rivalries. Those rivalries in 1914, after a series of crises around the succession and challenges in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the assassination by Serbian terrorists of the Archduke, the heir to the throne, all of this I'm sure you cover in your textbooks. What caused the war was the fear that each of these societies had that the others were on the cusp of getting ahead. And so that each had to act aggressively now before they would be behind. It's sort of like they were in a cage fight. Each of them felt they were in their strongest possible position, and that if time went on, the other sides, the other actors would get stronger. This is what some call the cult of the offensive, that the time to move was now. Each society triggered a set of actions, beginning with the Austro-Hungarian response to the assassination of the Archduke that brought in the larger powers. This was a war no one wanted, but it was a war everyone believed they had to fight because they thought their position would be worse tomorrow, that they were better off fighting today than allowing their position to be worse tomorrow. And it resulted in what I showed you before. It resulted in this horrible experience of armies and societies mobilized as they had not been before. The only example is the Civil War in the United States, where young people on a scale never before, industrial machinery on a scale never before, was sent to kill people on this scale. Each of those European societies had a true lost generation of young people who never came home, or when they came home, were not able to function in the way that they had functioned before. If you want to know the story of the end of the European empires, it is the story of World War I. It is the story of World War I. By the way, many of the empires were changed in other ways too. India, where my family comes from, Indians were mobilized into the British Army for the first time. And that was the beginnings of Indian independence, because as the British mobilized Indians into the Indian Army, Indians began to argue, as African Americans and other minorities were in the US military, if we as second-class citizens are now brought in to fight for you, we want rights. We want rights we didn't have before. World War I is crucial, actually, for Indian independence. The United States sought to stay out of this war. The American position had been a position of neutrality. We were not going to get involved in these wars. That had always been our position. Let me actually go back to the map one more sentence for that. We had always argued that we should be able to trade with both sides. And in fact, the United States provided the cotton for the uniforms on both sides, the Colt manufacturers provided the guns for both sides, and our financiers financed both sides. We didn't do it just to make money. We did it because we believed it was not our war. We believed it was not our war. That was Wilson's position on this. By the way, that had been the American position on wars in Europe since the Revolution. It was why the British had attacked us in 1812, why we had gone to war with the British, and then the British had attacked Washington because we were selling to the French. And it had been the position we held consistently until this time, except during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln said he didn't want the British trading with the Southerners. But other than that, this was our position. Our position was that we could trade with whoever we wanted. But it was hard to remain neutral. It was hard to remain neutral when one side looked like this. Kaiser Wilhelm II was, if we think about the disruptive leaders of our time, he was the disruptive leader of his time. He was the idiot savant, a man who truly was not prepared to be a military leader, who thought he was the military genius that he wished he could become, and continually would say things. He didn't tweet, but if the Twitter existed, he would have been tweeting, saying things that he believed would show his strength, but that it made it very hard for Americans in particular to stay out of this war. His view was that the United States owed Germany its help, that they were a subordinate country to Germany, as the British were. He had disdain for the United States, and this was a real problem. And the British played to this propaganda. This is an actual propaganda poster. The original is held at the Ransom Center at UT. Many of you have seen these posters. Look at this. And the British had a big advantage in that even though Americans were pretty split in their opinion on the British and the Germans, just think of how many German Americans there are in Texas, Fredericksburg, how many German Americans in the Midwest. It was very hard, though, with this propaganda to really stay neutral. Foreign countries trying to influence how we think. That would never happen in our time, would it? Foreign countries trying to influence how we think. This is a British propaganda poster here. It's incredibly powerful. Look at the German ape. Look at the damsel in distress. Look at the bat that says Kultur on it. And we could do a whole 2-hour lecture just on these posters. Students, I find, love these, by the way. You can get them online through the Ransom Center. I know the Humanities Texas can help with that if you wish. The United States tried to stay neutral, but the real problem was that our neutrality meant that we were supporting or providing goods to different actors. And the British controlled most of the Atlantic sea lanes. So the British cut off our ability to trade with Germany, which meant that even though we were acting neutrally, by 1915, 1916, 95% of our trade or so was actually going to Great Britain, not getting through to Germany, because the British ships would not allow our things to get through. The Germans began a series of submarine attacks on shipping. This is the U-boat warfare, the submarine warfare. The Germans did not have the quality navy the British had, but they did what any weaker power does. This is what we call asymmetrical warfare. You find an alternative way to use a lower technology, it could be a terrorist act or whatever it is, to attack the more powerful actor. And so they used these very primitive submarines, trust me, none of you would want to go in one, to ram and torpedo ships. And one of the worst examples of this was the sinking of the Lusitania on the 7th of May, 1915. A journalist in 1930 went back and talked to people who had been alive in this period. They all remembered, Americans, where they were when the Lusitania went down. This was like the assassination of John F. Kennedy for that generation, or 9/11 for my generation. You knew where you were. You remembered where you were when this happened. This was an American cruise ship that was torpedoed by the Germans, killing a large number of Americans, a total of 1,260 dead. And here's, of course, the New York Times headline from it. This was an outrage to Americans. Why were our innocent civilians being killed just for going across the Atlantic? The Germans had warned the ship, and the ship, even though it was a civilian ship, it was carrying military material in its cargo, particularly gun cartridges for the British. Sort of like our airplanes today when we could still fly, right? Our commercial aircraft are always carrying the mail. right? And the mail is carrying things that could be contraband of one kind or another. The Germans promised after this incident to limit their submarine warfare, and they did for a long time, until early 1917, when they found that they were running out of supplies, and their only strategy was to cut off American supplies to Britain. The only way to beat the British was to stop the United States from continuing to supply the British. We had an unending supply of food, unending supply of cotton, unending supply of military material. The Germans had to cut off British access because they did not have similar access for themselves. So they increased the level of submarine warfare again in 1917. They did this out of desperation, not because they hated Americans, but it played to this image. It played to this image. One of the really important points to get across to students is that our images of other societies are not often accurate representations of them. There's a difference between seeing the image of a society and understanding a society. One of the reasons we study history is so we get beyond images alone, beyond what we think we see. And many societies do things that look horrible to us, but they have reasons. It doesn't justify what they're doing, but they have reasons. This was compounded, this problem, by Wilson's new Secretary of State, who had replaced William Jennings Bryan, Robert Lansing, who was pro-British. We could talk more about that. But what really sent this over the top was the so-called Thezimmerman telegram, which I know comes up in lots and lots of textbooks. And so I always like to spend a little time on this. The Thezimmerman telegram was real. It was real. Alfred Zimmerman, who was worked in the German Foreign Ministry, sent this telegram to Mexico. But he was not, as some claimed. You can see it went through Galveston, by the way. It went through Galveston. He was not trying to organize an immediate alliance of the Mexicans against the United States. That's what it looked like. The telegram said that if Mexico would help the Germans would help Mexican claims against territory that the United States had taken from Mexico, insignificant things like California, parts of Texas, Arizona. Zimmerman was not actually proposing to do that. He was putting out there a possible mutuality of interests that the Germans and the Mexicans would have. But this is a classic case of not using your words carefully. Another lesson we want to teach our students: use your words carefully. The telegram was intercepted by the British, decoded in January of 1917, and then they held it until March of 1917 and released it, and made it sound like it was a lot more than it was. So it was real, but it was exaggerated by the British. But to Americans, this was a sign that the Germans were now in their submarine warfare doing more than just protecting themselves, but actually coming into our space. From the German point of view, they were desperate to find any anchor they could find against the constant supplies the United States was sending to Britain. They were looking to cut that off. They were not looking in any sense to attack the United States, but it came to seem that way. And by March of 1917, you had a bit of a war hysteria in the United States. Again, not a majority of Americans, but a large number of vocal people believing that the United States needed to get into this war. Loudest among the yellers, loudest among the people claiming this was former President Theodore Roosevelt himself, who was still an incredibly popular figure at the time, but many others. Many newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer, most notoriously, said that the problem at this moment was that the Germans were at war with us, which was not true, but they said this, and we were not fighting back. We were not fighting back. That's the context for Wilson going to Congress. It's really important to understand that it was a war no one wanted, and it was certainly a war that Wilson did not want. He had run in 1916 saying he was too proud to fight. But he went to Congress in April of 1917, and he went to Congress to get a declaration of war, when we still did it that way, as the Constitution says. He went to Congress to get a declaration of war because he believed now that the fighting in Europe had gotten out of hand, and that the United States had to step in to bring order. That our own security for our trade, for our goods, for our people was imperiled, and that we had to get into this war, as he said, so the world could be made safe for democracy. So the world could be made safe for democracy. Those same words will be used for every American military engagement thereafter. Most wars the United States goes into, World War II is an exception, are wars that are uncertain, and where Americans don't know why they're going in always, but they believe that they have to go in to make the world safe for democracy. democracy. It doesn't always mean that's what we're doing, but I think that's part of the intentionality that's often involved here. He promised that this would be a war to end all wars, that this would be a war to end all wars, and that the United States would be involved in promoting what he called the 14 points program. And I know you go over this with all your students. It's often the DBQ, what's on the 14 points. Chief among the 14 points was creating a system of governance for the world that would not replace states, but would limit the violence that states created, limit the rivalries between states. The United States hated empires abroad. Roosevelt felt this way, Franklin, as did Theodore before him. Wilson certainly did. Empires caused war. We needed some international governance. But it was also a hierarchical world that Wilson believed in, that the white people had to be the leaders. They had to be the ones to set the stage, to tutor the other societies. So when Wilson spoke of self-determination, he did not mean independence for India. He did not mean independent statehood for African states. He meant independence for Poland, which was actually mentioned in the 14 points. He meant independence for what he saw as the more civilized parts of the world. And he believed that moving to a world of common governance meant we had to do things to help civilize other areas and prevent war, but not to create full equality. So there's a deep racial hierarchy built into Wilson's thinking. And I always remind people, Wilson was the first Southern president since 1848, since F.D. Taylor. He was the first Southern president since the 1840s. So he brought with him a different view of American power. Not that Northerners were free of racism either, but he was a child of the Confederacy. That world was still alive for Woodrow Wilson in every way. If you look at images of him, if you listen to his speeches, what we have recorded, if you look at his text, you can see that in him. And that's not to condemn him, it is to understand from where he came. Wilson's vision of this world, of this more orderly world, that the United States would step in to make the world safe for democracy, it didn't turn out that way for a number of reasons. And that's perhaps a whole new lecture, but I do want to say a few things about that. Part of the reason, of course, was that the other powers didn't want to go along. But part of the reason was the United States was uncertain how to do this. The divisions were not just divisions between isolationists and internationalists. They were divisions over how many resources we would be able to put into this and how we would do this and what it would mean to do this. It was not something we had thought through very well. I wrote a whole book a few years ago making the case, in fact, that our model was actually what we did in the American South after the Civil War. That was the only experience Americans really had with nation building, with post-war Reconstruction. And as all of us know in Texas, the experience of what we did after the Civil War, it had some good and bad elements. It was certainly far from perfect, far from a model of what you'd want to do in other societies. So there was an uncertainty about how to do this. One of the big legacies of the war was that getting involved in solving international problems was necessary, but incredibly difficult. And that we really felt we had to, but didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to do. When T.S. Eliot talks about hollow men, that's what he means. He's talking about these men here who see a problem, but haven't figured out how to solve it. Also, the world the United States was entering, was a world where now we would have to deal with people who are very different from ourselves, with cultural diversity on a scale we hadn't before. And that cultural diversity would be a challenge for us. What would it mean to be civilized? What would it mean to be a white society that itself was becoming more diverse, in a world that was becoming more diverse? Part of what T.S. Eliot is talking about is the uncertainty of what it means to be civilized. What are our values in a world that looks so different now, that's changing so rapidly? How do we fit technology to who we are? How do we rethink our values in this context? And then there was the paradox of power and powerlessness. We had become so much more powerful now, being part of this war, helping to end this war, but we were still so limited in what we could do. And the pandemic was really part of that story. How we had mastered, many argued, the power to kill, but we had not mastered the power to save. We had mastered the power to kill, but not the power to save. These were dilemmas that would stick with the United States for many, many years. And when T.S. Eliot wrote about the hollow men, he was one of many in the 19-teens and 20s, reflecting on this period, reflecting on how hard we had tried, first to stay out, than when we went in to make things better, and how poor the outcomes were. He was not saying we should not be involved. He was not saying that we should just have no role in the world at all. He was saying that we were deeply confused, disillusioned, and uncertain, and that there was a new generation that would have to figure these questions out. That would become, not the generation of the 1920s, that would become the generation of the Great Depression and World War II. But that is another story. Maybe the people making noise in my house behind me will be the ones to answer that story. But I feel like I should probably give some time for questions right now. I hope that was a good introduction to at least starting to talk about some of these issues. Thank you.